Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ashley Johnson and I'm a policy analyst for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Today we'll be discussing how the federal government can make its websites more accessible for people with disabilities. Joining me today, I'll have Stephanie Enyart, Chief Public Policy and Research Officer at the American Foundation for the Blind, and Andrew Kirkpatrick, Head of Accessibility at Adobe. We'll also be hearing later on from Congressman Jim Langevin, who co-chairs the Congressional Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome everyone watching the stream online. Please feel free to ask our panelists questions at any time during the event. If you're watching at itif.org, you can use the Q&A form under the video. And if you're watching on YouTube, follow the link in the description. Too often, organizations treat web accessibility as an afterthought instead of as a necessity. Not every user is able to see or hear web content or use a keyboard and mouse to navigate websites. Websites that rely on only those tools create unnecessary barriers for the millions of Americans who have a disability. Federal government websites are no exception. And as more of our daily lives have moved online, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, ensuring access to digital government services has become even more important. At ITIF, we recently published a report evaluating popular federal government websites' adherence to Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which requires federal electronic and information technology to be accessible to people with disabilities. We found that 70% of these websites passed a basic accessibility test for their homepage, and only 52% passed for 3 of their most popular pages. Overall, our assessments revealed a large amount of variation in how agencies are meeting accessibility requirements. In today's discussion, we'll talk about why web accessibility is so important, why some organizations find it difficult, and how the federal government can better prioritize web accessibility going forward. So we'll move on to the panel discussion now. So I'll start by asking you a question, Andrew. How does Adobe successfully prioritize accessibility for its own products? And what mechanisms or standards does Adobe have in place to ensure its products are accessible for people with disabilities? Oh, and you're still muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Ashley, and thanks for inviting me to join the panel. At Adobe, we have an internal process that we use to track where we are with regard to accessibility for our products. It's called CCF, or the Common Control Framework. And within there, we have criteria for teams related to overall governance, making sure that the teams are well prepared to address accessibility. These are items related to having a main point of contact, having a test plan, producing documentation, having a roadmap for accessibility. And then we also have items related to compliance or conformance with specific criteria. And generally, these are based on Section 508, WCAG, or the EN 301549. Our teams, we expect them to work on accessibility with the target being WCAG 2.1 AA. And we also have accessibility as part of our product lifecycle review process. So products go through what we call the SLC, the services lifecycle, and there's different steps where we make sure that they're aware that the teams are aware of the requirements that they need to be paying attention to for accessibility, and that they're actually putting in place plans for how to integrate those improvements and features into the product. Our products aren't perfect yet, and all software has issues, but our goal with our current program is to address the gaps that exist today and to prevent future ones. What I've talked about so far is really about the oversight into where the products are at, and a little bit about their planning process. But we also have at Adobe our internal design system called Spectrum and shared UI component libraries. The one we use a lot for our web-based products is called React Spectrum. Both of these are open source They're available for people to view on the web and even adapt. And these really are key to helping our teams reduce the learning curve for designers and engineers and help them more reliably create accessible products and integrate accessibility into the overall process.
So when it comes to other organizations, what are some of the common mistakes that they can make or that you have seen them make when it comes to web accessibility?
There's lots of potential mistakes, obviously, but I'm going to focus on kind of the high-level types of mistakes. So number one is not thinking about accessibility, not thinking about it during development, not thinking about it during design, and sometimes not even thinking about it until a customer comes or an end user comes and says, this is a problem. And sometimes not even that. I see other companies assume that accessibility is too hard, and so they don't start because they're fearful that it's going to be, a bigger effort than they have resources for. I've seen situations where they assume that it's too easy and assume that it can wait until the last development sprint. And not surprisingly, often that means that when everything else is more complicated than anticipated, that last development sprint is dedicated to finishing other work rather than doing accessibility work. So that's probably one of the most common things that I see in a lot of big companies where they're underestimating the effort of a variety of things, including accessibility. And when it waits to the last moment, it gets squeezed out. Some of the things, just as an end user going around using the web, ignoring keyboard testing. I would say probably the number one thing that any developer can do when they're building their content is just put away the mouse and testing it from the keyboard. And making sure that you can tell where the keyboard focus is, making sure that you can activate all content. Very, very simple things like that, or using the free tools that are available to test accessibility issues on a site, being able to identify programmatically identifiable issues like missing alternative text on images, form controls that don't have labels. These are so easy to use, and there's really no excuse to not, when you're developing content, to not use them and know where you're at with regard to accessibility. Some of these tools, the simple tools that do programmatic testing, they can't find everything, but they really do find a lot of the core things. It will tell you whether your alternative text on an image is missing. It can't tell you if it's there, if it's right, but if you have a good process for development and you're expecting and you're testing and measuring that people are building content, adding content, and adding appropriate alternative text, then you can kind of assume a certain amount of goodwill on the part of the authors. And if it's missing, the tool will check it and then it can get fixed. So, kind of in summary, it's thinking about accessibility throughout the process, but particularly at the early design stages, starting early and maintaining throughout the process.
Do you know of any sort of unique difficulties that federal government agencies might face in addition to these common mistakes that you've seen organizations make or barriers that they face?
I think the problems that a lot of the federal government sites have are related to scale and volume of legacy content, legacy systems that are out there. And I can certainly appreciate, Adobe is a big company. We have a very large website. Being able to fix everything and being able to have confidence that everything is, just as it needs to be from an accessibility perspective is, incredibly challenging. And of course, things are changing all the time too. So it's not just challenging in a static sense, it's challenging every day, and it'll be a little bit different tomorrow. So I think that this is part of what we have within the federal government as well. There's new content that's created, and maybe the systems are old and don't deal with accessibility as well as we want. One of the things that in the federal government that Adobe has supported, there's an act, the 21st Century IDEA, which stands for the Integrated Digital Experience Act, which is really about modernization of government sites. And within it, it does include an indication that sites and forms need to meet Section 508 requirements, but in many cases, it's really that modernization that to ensure that content is available on mobile devices and that it works well with current assistive technologies and current browsers will really help address a lot of the long-standing issues that are found on the legacy systems.
So what are some of the steps that organizations in general, and especially the federal government, can take to specifically make sure that web accessibility is a high priority in their development process?
So I'll speak to the federal government first about this. I mean, and I think that the same things that are going on there also apply to other organizations. So on the 25th of June, the president issued an executive order, which I think is a very good start because it's demonstrating leadership and commitment to accessibility. And in this case, this was about diversity, equality, inclusion more broadly. And part of what this order includes, it expands training throughout the federal workforce, which is critical, whether it's federal or a private sector company. People have to know what we're talking about for accessibility. They have to know how to handle it. And then this executive order also charged the Department of Labor and the U.S. Access Board with the coordination to ensure that federal workplaces and the technology used are accessible. So, having that sort of that leadership vision, having some accountability to make sure that it's getting the attention that's needed is really critical. So I think that, and then also it's been a great sign that the administration is seeking feedback from stakeholders to improve accessibility. There was an OMB request for information on supporting underserved communities through government. And it's great to have opportunities like that where all the different stakeholders can provide some input. And I think Adobe responded to that, provided some input because we have our design standards and practices, and we've worked for many years to try and ensure that our products can support accessibility well and allow customers to create accessible content. So I think it's a great sign seeing that sort of reaching out from the government to figure out the best way to deliver on these commitments. Excellent.
And we're going to pause our panel discussion for a moment here because Representative Langevin has just joined us to give his remarks. So we'll transition over to him. As I mentioned earlier, Congressman Langevin is the co-chair of the Congressional Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus, and we're very pleased to have him give remarks about this important subject today.
Very good. Well, good afternoon, Ashley. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me on briefly to give some thoughts, some remarks, and I appreciate the focus on the issue of accessibility and inclusion. And thank you all for the extraordinary work you're doing. But again, I'm especially delighted to be here today with the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, other guests to discuss the importance, really the necessity of accessible website design. We all can appreciate as the world moves increasingly online, we need to be sure that all people, especially people with disabilities, maintain equal access to information and services. As the founder and co-chair of the Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus and someone who lives with a disability, making our nation accessible to all is among my top priorities, not only as a member of Congress, but also as an American who strives to overcome accessibility challenges every single day. So our country has made tremendous progress over the past several decades to better protect the rights of people with disabilities. I've seen it firsthand. My accident that left me paralyzed happened a full 10 years before the passage of the ADA. And so I remember what the world was like before ADA and what it has been like after. And it has made a marked difference in my life and the lives of millions of people with disabilities. The dedicated, tireless advocates of the disability community has led to the passage of several landmark anti-discrimination laws, including the Rehabilitation Act, the Air Carrier Access Act, and of course, again, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it's safe to say that these bills, as well as several others, have drastically improved the lives of millions of disabled individuals. Despite the progress we've made in the years, these recent years, though, people with disabilities still face countless barriers to accessibility. When we talk about this issue, most people find it easiest to identify physical barriers, such as inadequate curb cuts or buildings with entrances that are only accessible by stairs. Yet, there are several other types of barriers. These include communications and technology barriers, which, while often less intuitive, nonetheless limit the extent to which people with disabilities can do certain things that most people simply take for granted. So, since the latter decades of the 20th century, the world is adopted and is becoming increasingly reliant on the internet. As we all know, the social distancing needs of the COVID-19 pandemic have only accelerated this trend. In fact, so many things that we used to do in person, by telephone or by mail, just even a year ago, are now commonly handled online. You just look at the widespread adoption of telework. So, and the Zoom conferences or calls, even just like we're on today. While the ever-increasing reliance on the internet comes with many benefits, if websites and other online services aren't designed with accessibility in mind, then they can restrict or limit access to critical information and services for people with disabilities. When we don't prioritize accessible website design, people with disabilities simply get left behind. That's unacceptable, pushing us farther away from our goal of universal accessibility and inclusion. So Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act requires federal government agencies to ensure that their electronic information technology is accessible to people with disabilities. The U.S. Access Board is responsible for maintaining proper accessibility standards for the implementation of this law. Now, presently, the Access Board requires agencies to comply with version 2.0 of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, which were developed by the Worldwide Web Consortium. Importantly, Section 508 applies to federal agency websites. And I can't emphasize enough the significance of this law. Americans use federal websites to learn about their government, to access benefits, and to contact their public officials. For the U.S. government to be truly of, for, and by the people, that every American, including people with disabilities, must have equal access to it. Unfortunately, and despite the requirements of Section 508, many federal agencies struggle to maintain accessible websites. Now, I commend the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation for the extensive analysis that it has conducted on this issue, but its findings confirm that there's widespread agency non-compliance with Section 508, and this is deeply troubling, and it should be a wake-up call and an alarm bell heard ringing loud and clear that we really need to change. So nearly half of the most popular federal websites failed an accessibility test on at least one of three most popular pages, and approximately 30% of websites that were tested failed the same test for their home pages. This means that many people with disabilities do not have equal access to government services and other online information. This is simply unacceptable. To help achieve universal accessibility and inclusion, the federal government absolutely must serve as the model for the rest of society. But if the federal government, which is responsible for creating and enforcing accessibility laws, can't even follow its own rules, what kind of message does that send to America about the importance of prioritizing the needs of the disability community. I'll say this, it certainly doesn't encourage the private sector to voluntarily maintain accessible websites. So this is just one of the main reasons why the federal government must improve its compliance with Section 508. Another concern surrounding Section 508 is that it only applies to the executive branch agencies. In other words, the legislative and judicial branches of the federal government, as well as state and local governments, aren't subject to its requirements. Now, as members of Congress, I know firsthand just how important my congressional website is to interacting with my constituents. My colleagues and I use our websites to share priorities, report on recent votes, and to publish our positions on important legislation. Our constituents also rely on our websites as a way to take part in our democracy and make informed decisions about their representation in Washington, D.C. While some members of Congress and committees do a great job maintaining accessible websites, others unfortunately do not. So people with disabilities absolutely have the right to participate in our democracy, which is why I've been working to increase the accessibility of congressional websites. Last year, I led a letter with Congressman Young, who, by the way, is my co-chair of the Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus, that asked the Chief Administration Officer of the House of Representatives to prioritize the digital accessibility of congressional websites. Specifically, we requested that all websites hosted by the Office of the Chief Administration Officer, as well as all websites provided by approved vendors, meet web content accessibility guidelines, which, as I mentioned before, are the same standards the Access Board requires for Section 508 compliance. The Chief Administration Officer has since informed me that efforts are underway right now to develop a website accessibility program that will make sure that all public House of Representative websites comply with version 2.1, level AA, and of the web content accessibility guidelines. This is exciting news, but we can't call it a win until every congressional website is truly accessible. So it's important to keep in mind that improving accessibility, while absolutely necessary, of course, isn't free. So I'm working to secure more funds to make Congress accessible to its members, staff, and constituents across the country. In April, I sent a letter to the House Appropriations Subcommittee on the legislative branch highlighting several accessibility barriers in Congress. In this letter, I made sure to emphasize the need for accessible congressional websites. To help achieve this, I requested funding increases for the Office of Congressional Accessibility Services and the House of Representatives Modernization Initiative account. And I'm working hard to make sure that these increases are included in the final fiscal year 2022 appropriations bill. I'd also like to add that the House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress has proposed several recommendations to make Congress more effective. One of these recommendations specifically calls for improving access to congressional websites for individuals with disabilities. In May, I had the opportunity to testify before the Modernization Committee in support of these recommendations. In my testimony, I emphasized the need for accessible website design as well as content that's uploaded in accessible formats. As the world moves increasingly online, as we can all appreciate, we need to make sure it does so in a way that's accessible, and the government has to step up its game to be a model for the rest of society to follow. So with that, we can't risk leaving millions of people with disabilities behind, and until we achieve universal accessibility and inclusion, we have to keep fighting the good fight. So with that, I just want to thank you again for asking me to join you this afternoon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the discussion today. And Ashley, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Representative Langevin. We're so happy to have you speak at this event today about such an important issue. And
Thanks.
We will turn the time back over to our panelists now. And I've got some questions for Stephanie, who I introduced earlier as the Chief Public Policy and Research Officer at the American Foundation for the Blind. So Stephanie, what are some of the barriers that blind and visually impaired people face when accessing government services online?
Sure. It is simply a myriad of different kinds of issues depending on the type of services that they're seeking. I mean, it could even be as straightforward as applicants that are trying to enter the federal workforce, attempting to apply through the USA Jobs portal, and then encountering any number of challenges with the additional questionnaires that many agencies ask as you apply for those positions, and that kind of interconnectedness between the accessibility of those underlying documents and that web portal. I know that that's been a barrier for many people with visual disabilities, especially that are reliant on screen readers. There could also be any number of things that differ agency to agency in how they're making something available and posted on their web page. For example, grant-making agencies may have volumes of information that are posted for people to digest and have related to the opportunities with their agency, but many of the documents, the underlying documents, might not be accessible once you click through and get into different spaces of the web page. Because the internet is really a layer, it's an onion, so to speak. You can have a lot of compliance and conformance with 508 on that external layer, and then as you dig deeper, where you actually have to interface with the government agency, in completing forms, following processes, reading fine print, some of the underlying pieces of the puzzle don't get the same level of kind of attention and scrutiny when we're looking at agencies. There's simply a variety of ways that people are trying to interface the government too. If you're looking at Department of Education as a space where they're administering the public education for America's children, there have been a myriad of issues, especially during COVID, for people using all kinds of online tools in the education space to be able to administer education to K through 12 students, and students with screen reading needs are struggling to be able to gain that basic access. Oftentimes things like a Chromebook, which seems to be a commonly used tool in that space, there are barriers. And so, we've been looking and pushing for things like guidance and more information and more kind of rigorous standards to be set. But those are just a flavor of some of the issues that people are facing.
And something that you have just touched on and that Representative Langevin also touched on in his remarks is how the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and also heightened the barriers that people with disabilities face when accessing digital and online services. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. This is something that the American Foundation for the Blind, where I'm located, we're especially interested in looking at this from a research perspective. At the beginning of COVID-19, we, in partnership and collaboration with many organizations and companies in the blindness space, put forward a research study that really uncovered a lot of the barriers in a variety of places that people were facing, a variety of different parts of life, from technology to voting to education to healthcare to getting basic needs met like food and services, et cetera. And we're actually in the process of repeating or refreshing really that kind of a survey in the blindness and low vision space in a study that we just released this week called Journey Forward, to continue to look at that, because obviously we are not in a space that is, I guess you could say, pre 2020, and that the social fabric is definitely shifted. And so when you look at any number of issues that people have been facing, that layer of COVID has added a layer of complexity and unique challenges for people who are blind and low vision, especially, where they may have been able to do something, maybe interfacing with a government agency in a certain way, the way that we have gone virtual or online, and that the level of accessibility of whatever those spaces and new pathways are is varied depending on what we're speaking about. And to the extent that COVID has added that unique layer to it, the interconnectedness with others, where you may be meeting with someone who works as a hired reader for you, those sorts of interactions have been very limited. And so, individuals with disabilities are basically, just as everyone else, very isolated in what they're able to do with their normal social network that they rely on in a different and unique way. And so from that standpoint, things like even voting, which was something that had quite a bit of focus several months ago, become a very, very challenging and unique situation because of COVID, and whether or not a paper ballot, a mail-in ballot, is something that you're able to find a way to complete on your own as someone who's blind. So really that layer of COVID and that need to be able to interface in the virtual environment is unique, depending on the type of information that you're trying to secure. Things like information about your vaccines and the ability to be able to book that vaccine appointment and also get safely to that vaccine appointment were huge stumbling blocks for people in the community, because ultimately many of these are locally managed, but many maps had to be navigated, visually speaking, to be able to kind of like find the right test center physically in your, in proximity to where you live. And these sorts of hurdles, create all kinds of extra stumbling blocks for people.
Thank you. Yeah, the American Foundation for the Blind's research on the impacts of COVID on accessibility has been really eye-opening and really important lately. So I'm glad that you were able to talk about that. And then I'll ask you a question that I asked Andrew earlier. What are some of the steps that the federal government could take to make web accessibility more of a priority?
Well, there are certainly a variety of different things that you could do in this space, and I know that the report that you put out highlighted many interesting strategies in that regard. One of the things that I know from my own service in the federal government is that when we're talking agency to agency, there is quite a bit of a discrepancy in the way that maybe some of the cabinet level agencies are handling it versus independent agencies or smaller agencies. And I dug deeper in that space to try to understand, the differences and distinctions. And something that's really interesting is that the reporting cycle for 508 compliance and conformance, that cycle of reporting where you have to provide information about how you've been doing as an agency and what your choices look like and what they've been, that is very different from an agency that is smaller versus larger, or parts of different kind of echelon in this space. And so there's not the same reporting cycle or timing that is required. And I think that there's some language that basically states that it is recommended that smaller agencies are providing the same 508 reporting as some of the larger ones, but it's not required. And I think a simple shift of making that really uniform does up the game, in the sense that everybody is at least putting forward that same amount of thought and justification and reporting. And I like the transparency that you have advocated for. I think that is a really important puzzle piece here, because anytime we have transparency, we're able to really see kind of the underpinning of the problem. So I think that in that vein, I think that there's lots of work that could be done here that could really kind of up the game and make it a bit more uniform and a bit more available to be looked at and to be worked on. And I certainly think that all of those strategies make a lot of sense in this space.
And then a question for both of you. I'll go to Andrew first and then Stephanie. How could agencies that already comply with existing requirements do even more to improve their web accessibility? Is there any way to go above and beyond in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. The WCAG standard is a starting point. It should not be regarded as the final goal, that once you've achieved conformance with WCAG AA, that you're all done. And compliance, conformance with WCAG is very important, and it provides meaningful improvements that will help end users. But ultimately, if you want to go beyond that, if you haven't already, and you should work with end users and do user testing and figure out how to make targeted improvements so that you can go above and beyond. Because in some cases, you can provide information that satisfies the criteria, but may not be as meaningful or useful to end users. and end users would have feedback about specific workflows and how information can be provided in ways that will work best for them. So there are definitely ways to go above and beyond the standards in order to make your sites even better.
I echo that user testing element as just a really key component in understanding how people are truly using the pages, because I know for a fact that many agencies will rely heavily on software, or individuals who don't actually, from a practical perspective, use the software. And as someone who has used it myself, it's very different to be able to hop onto any website and simply independently navigate around using the normal keystrokes and commands that I use, versus someone who doesn't on a day-to-day basis use this and have to kind of test things out in a different way. So I think that that's a very key ingredient. I also think that we could truly up the game related to great success in the space, or related to 508, for agencies that are getting it right, that are truly, making things very, very accessible. There's all kinds of things that they've done to get to that space. And if there's a way to have far more interagency dialogue, or even kind of a bit of a toolkit, so to speak, of best practices across agencies. Here is how we figured this or that out in putting something specific on our webpage, or in doing something else in this virtual space. I think that kind of dialogue could truly help agencies that have less resources get it right themselves. So,
excellent recommendations, both of you. And final question before we answer any audience questions that we've received. And as a reminder to our live audience, you can go into the Q&A form under the video and type in any questions that you have if you're watching on ITIF.org. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can follow the link in the description. So final question from me. Any additional other recommendations that both of you would make for the federal government to improve web accessibility? And I'll go to Andrew first again.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, beyond what I mentioned earlier, which is fully implementing the 21st century IDEA to modernize the sites and to help get rid of some of the legacy content and the legacy systems that are not supporting accessibility as well. I think that one of the key things that should be looked at closely, and hopefully will, is that the federal government is capable of impacting web accessibility beyond federally managed content. And I think that there is a need to clarify the applicability of the ADA to the web for Title II and III. Which will also help address the current confusion in the legal climate regarding private sector and state and local websites. Representative Langevin, spoke to the need to have state and local websites address accessibility as well as private sector, and this is a step that could definitely help with that. It's very important to have an achievable target. WCAG 2.0, 2.1, AA. It's a great goal. But the reality of delivering content for all users at all but a very small scale is that bugs exist, and so we need to make sure that we have some flexibility built into that sort of policy. For example, related to user-generated content, where the site owner doesn't control it directly. But I think there's work that can be done to ensure that the applicability of the ADA to Title II and Title III would really have a very widespread impact on the web in general.
And Stephanie, any additional recommendations before we move on to audience questions?
I think that Andrew really hit it out of the park. I wholeheartedly agree with everything that he said, especially about the fact that the federal government could truly serve as a model in this space for so many others, whether we're talking state and local, or even corporate areas. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and clarity as well as modeling in this space.
Excellent. So audience questions. There's one here that I think is something that we at ITIF have just begun to start thinking about. And I wanted to see if either of you have begun to think about this either. So as government moves to make content available on non-web-based platforms like smart speakers, VR, et cetera, how should they address accessibility issues where no standards exist so far?
I can speak to that if you want. So first of all, I mean, there are standards that are in development for that. You know, at the W3C, there's a group that is doing work on that, but it's a very important question, and it's a question that will come up again and again and again, which is, you know, how do you enforce accessibility for something that there's not a specific standard for? And you know, and the standards need to be developed, but the way that the standards get developed at the W3C is we look at what is working today. So the standards development process doesn't happen, you know, in a black box. It's that, you know, member companies and invited experts come in and they say, this is what we're doing, you know, how does that, you know, and here's how it works. So it really is getting back to, you know, thinking about integrating design accessibility and inclusion into your design efforts, finding out how things are working with end users. And then we can get to a point where we say, these are the strategies that work in these situations. Let's standardize those so that we can then make that the bar that people now need to meet when they're producing content of this sort.
Excellent. And Stephanie, any thoughts on accessibility where there aren't standards?
No, I think that what Andrew said makes a lot of sense, and I think that there's always that universal design from the beginning sort of approach that should be really endorsed and thought through, as well as that end user testing to help inform any direction you're going, because it's at both ends that you're trying to get the problem to be, you know, eliminated. And so, you know, whether you're talking design or end user, you need to really have both of those in mind anytime you're in new territory.
A couple of these comments and questions in our form that we have under the stream have reminded me of some topics that I've discussed with both of you in the past and that I wanted to bring up again. Stephanie, I believe in our previous discussions, you and I have talked about how, again, COVID-19 has sort of emphasized and deepened a lot of divides that exist in this country with accessibility, and for people with disabilities being one of those divides. And one of these comments here has prompted me to ask you, where are there significant overlaps between these different divides that we need to consider when we are thinking about accessibility, such as homeless populations, people in poverty, racial divides, and how that intersects with disability and with accessibility issues?
Sure. And is it specific to COVID, this particular question, or just going forward after what we've all been through?
Yeah, let's say going forward.
Going forward. I think that one of the things the lessons that we've learned in this time period is that, you know, as an entire society shifts to try to adapt to some very different circumstances, we've, you know, collectively, societally seen where a lot of intersectionality issues of all types have really bubbled up. You know, I guess you could say the need for shifts. You know, when things became a landscape of drive-through, drive-up, curbside, all of the communities who do not have the ability to own or operate vehicles are impacted by that. And so that's far more than, let's just say, blind individuals, but individuals with all kinds of other issues that prevent them from being able to be car owners and drivers. And so I think that one of the things that we should think about as we have a lessons learned moment societally is that intersectionality is a huge thing to plan and respond to as we develop policies going forward. And so, in the same way that a curb cut is something that we originally designed for individuals who use wheelchairs, the business traveler with the roller bag and the mom with the stroller are the huge everyday beneficiaries of the very same thing. And, as we move towards any number of other shifts in our society, whether we get to a space where autonomous vehicles are the norm, and that creates a very different reality in terms of travel, anywhere where we are going, whether we're talking advancements in technology or other social issues, that intersectional lens is something that we have to engage and think about and plan for, because it truly has a lot of interconnected pieces, as we've seen in COVID and how it has impacted other communities very differently and uniquely.
Excellent, very well said. And then Andrew, something that in the comments that reminded me of our discussions that you and I have previously had. We have discussed in our previous conversations how a lot of federal government website building and development is outsourced to contractors, and how that can present an issue when there isn't as much centralized control over and oversight over how well accessibility standards are being implemented. Can you talk a little bit about the issues that that can present, and perhaps how the federal government can ensure that contractors are meeting these accessibility standards as well as the agencies themselves are supposed to?
Yep. Yeah, sure. I think the core issue is not about whether it's a contractor or whether it is someone who is just, their work is not being evaluated and measured in a way that helps surface the level of accessibility that is or isn't being provided. And I think that, part of what we've done at Adobe that has really helped us is, establishing clear metrics and clear processes to evaluate our products and where they're at with regard to accessibility, and where they got to the next quarter and the next quarter. And I think the same strategy, driving improvement through, a continual review of the metrics and being able to really look at what has been done. So I don't think it's related to the contractors, but it's making sure that everyone at the agency within the government knows. And I think this is, very much to the credit of the work that ITIF did, surfacing and making visible where the agency sites are accessible and where they're not. Even just a thin sliver of them is going to, raise the awareness and increase the chances that as projects are done, accessibility requirements become included, because they know they're going to get asked about it. They know that if it's not working well, that it's going to be a problem that's identified. Helps keep people's focus on doing the right thing. And over time, I think that, develops into a muscle memory for development processes and procurement processes that will, help drive the continuous improvement that we really need.
Excellent.
So sorry, I have one other thought, somewhat.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's related to the dance between government contractors and the federal agencies themselves. When I was inside the federal government, it was clear to me that obviously a federal agency needs to comply with 508, but all of the government contractors that they're in a relationship with, the products and services that are being contracted for, those only need to comport with what 508 states. And so often you would have a space where an agency would be leaning on any number of government contractors to provide, let's say, different products that they want developed. Maybe it's something for their webpage related to e-learning like an e-course or a series of e-courses, and that government contractor has to basically deliver something to the federal agency that will comport. It doesn't necessarily have to fully comply. And so that federal agency has to be savvy enough, have the staff in the right places, savvy enough to really kind of dig in and figure out, is what we're getting from the government contractor truly something that works for us? And in some cases, they miss the ball. They're relying on the government contractor to deliver something, and they don't know if it actually meets 508 with their own level of internal expertise, given how thinly staffed these areas can be within federal agencies. And so I think that there is an area where, if we, from a broader societal, American perspective, if we were all working with the same types of requirements, in other words, if corporate and federal were all working with the same baseline requirement on accessibility, these sorts of questions about, contractor and federal agency, they would have to be resolved ultimately, because we'd all be working with the same baseline accessibility needs. So I think that would actually take some of the labor out of the burden that the federal government has in managing the contracts that they have in place.
Excellent point. And then I've got another question here that's very specific, but that I think relates to a larger issue, and one that Andrew brought up earlier in our discussion. So someone points out that a lot of responses to FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, are not accessible. For example, scans of PDFs with black redacted text. And that relates to a point that Andrew made earlier, that one of the issues that the federal government deals with that is maybe not necessarily unique to federal government agencies, but certainly one that they deal with at a very large scale, is the sheer volume of legacy content, scanned documents that used to be available only in paper form, these PDFs that are not accessible. So any recommendations, and I'll start with Andrew here, on how agencies could begin to deal with and perhaps implement better systems for these amounts of legacy content to make sure that they are accessible?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. I get requests reasonably regularly from whether it's libraries or government agencies that basically they're asking for an automated tool that will take hundreds of thousands of scanned PDF documents and automatically make them fully conforming with WCAG. And right now there's not a tool that will do that. I mean, we are doing work at Adobe using AI and machine learning to better enable the automatic identification and scanning documents to make them more accessible. And we will continue to work on that. And I hope that someday we can get to the point where we don't need to worry about the challenges there, that it'll just automatically happen. But for now, it's a big amount of effort to make the document accessible. So I think, there needs to be a policy within a specific agency that, relates to the prioritization of documents that they need to work on to make accessible. When someone provides a FOIA request, and I've never done a FOIA request, so I'm not sure whether I can specify that it needs to be accessible content for that request or not. But I mean, that content should be accessible, of course. So clearly, if you've got scanned documents and 100 of them are part of a FOIA request, then you need to prioritize getting those documents higher up in the queue to be made accessible. But it's definitely a long effort that we're going to have for many years before we get to the point where this is all just handled seamlessly.
And I'm going to wrap up audience questions for now, since we've only got about 5 minutes remaining, and I want to give both of you a couple of minutes to give any closing remarks. So again, I'll start with you, Andrew, and then Stephanie, you can wrap us up.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank ITIF for inviting me to the panel, and to Representative Langevin for joining and sharing his remarks. I think the bottom line is that we're all trying to make sure that the web can be accessible as possible, whether that's government services, private sector products and services. And I think fortunately in the space of accessibility, we've got a common set of standards. So we don't have the wide diversity of standards that are required in some other contexts like privacy or security. So we've got a set that industry and government can focus their energies on, trying to address the problems. And those problems are significant. We need to work hard to address them. But I think that some of the things that that Stephanie mentioned, having the same set of standards for industry as government, I think we actually, we've gotten to that point where we're all concerned about the same set of standards. And I think that we're seeing progress and we're seeing improvements. And I, look forward to that, continuing and, the web getting more and more accessible. But again, as I mentioned before, it won't happen unless we pay close attention to it, that we keep monitoring and measuring and making sure that we're holding the people who are offering the content, we're holding them accountable for how accessible it is.
Thank you so much. And Stephanie?
Sure. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to be here and congratulate ITIF on an important report as well. One of the things that I really wanted to stress is the usability element. So much of what we get wrapped up in is related to what the standards say and how we can implement them and whether or not we have met them. And I think that there is an added element of usability that really is the barrier for many individuals actually using assistive software to be able to navigate on the web or in other spaces. And so to keep that in mind, something like user testing is an important element to always keep at the table and involved in any kind of conversation. And I say that because, the conversation today is websites, but it could equally be mobile apps. It could equally be any number of other technologies and emerging technologies and future technologies. This is essentially never ending, so to speak. And so as we think about the future and we think about accessibility and equity in terms of full access and participation for all, I think that it's really important to keep in mind that you can have something be technically accessible, but it might not be that user-friendly. And so never lose that experiential element of that end user testing in whatever you're doing or in however you're monitoring yourself as well. So.
All right, thank you both for joining me today. This was a really great discussion. And of course, thanks to Representative Langevin for giving his remarks on how important this subject is and the work that he and his colleagues in Congress are doing to address these important issues. I just want to remind everyone in our audience, ITIF has a report on this subject called Improving Accessibility of Federal Government Websites that you can read if you would like to hear more. And of course, the American Foundation for the Blind has been doing work on this subject as well. So do check out those publications if you would like to know more. And thank you so much for joining us today. And that'll wrap it up for today. And looking forward to speaking with you both in the future.